You confirm you can see that?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all so much for coming along on this walk today. And it will just take me a little while before I find my comfort in speaking with you on this medium. This is the third, I think, in a series I've done called Finding the River, because the river is not a fixed thing. It's always flowing. It's never the same river twice. It's not the river that it was at the time of white settlement. It continues to change. And so we have to find the river anew every time we visit. And before we begin this important walk along the river, I'd like to acknowledge the YRKA dwelling of the Birrarung and the Wurundjeri YRKA, who have had ongoing connections, relationships and custodianship of the river and the lands that adjoin the river for thousands and thousands of years. And this walk is conducted in the spirit of the Yarra River Protection Act, Willet Jen Birrarung Maran, which means to keep the Birrarung alive. And the Act acknowledges the intrinsic connection of the traditional owners of the Yarra River and its country, and recognises them as the custodians of the land and the waterway, which they call Birrarung. So I've constructed this walk as much like a walk that we would take together were we able to, and possibly very soon you'd be able to revisit these places in person. So this is where we're going to start. This is at Pier 35 on Lorimer Street, and we're taking a look up the Maribyrnong. And this photograph was taken yesterday when it was very grey, and it reminded me a bit of all, those maritime, traditional maritime artworks. There's something about the river on a grey day that just conveys the sort of mystery and the magic of ports around the world. But now we'll just look on and go down to the river, because you can't begin a walk along the river until you've got down to the river. Now at Pier 35, they've got these lower boat landings, and they're really meant for boats, but actually I think they're wonderful for people because you can get very, very close to the water. And the river challenges our preconceptions, because I'd gone down to that landing thinking, oh, this is Port River, not much happening there. And as I went down to that lower landing, the swan came up and said, I live here, this is my place. And when we get down to the river, it's good to check out, what colour is it today? Because the river's never the same colour 2 days in a row. In which way is it flowing? Is the tide going in or out? Is the water disturbed or flat? So this is the kind of connection with the river that we can have. Now, there's something about this river in port kind of land that makes you sort of feel a bit kind of uncomfortable with the river in a way, a bit reluctant to put your hand or your foot in it. But our aspiration is for a healthy river flowing from river to mouth, whether it's in the port or higher up in the catchment. We want to do whatever's in our power to improve the health of the Yarra River. So we're going to go up a little. This is the view from the Port Control Tower, which is very close to Pier 35. And you can see where all those containers are stacked, just giving you a sense that this is a very, very port part of the world. On your right is Cood Island, in the background is Footscray. Now, to make it so, part of a theme of this walk is just the influence of the port on this part of the river, both historically and going forward into the future. And to almost understand the scene, I'd like to go back to have a look at this map. This is Cox's chart of 1864, and it gives us as close as we can get to a sense of how the river was at the time of white settlement. So take a look at the shape of the river, you know, how diffuse its edges were, how wet the area was. All these denote wet places. But most of all, take a look at this bend here in the course of the Yarra River as it made its way into Melbourne. Now, the river at that time, as it does still, it drained the whole of the Yarra catchment. So when there were big rainfalls, you know, the water would come down the river. But unlike today, where it goes, you know, hastily out to the river would have in those days, in a flood event, just sort of flown over these areas here, leaving some of them wet for a period of time. And this led to the Yarra River Delta being immensely rich as a place of birds and fish and eel, you know, an absolutely abundant place. That was the nature of the Yarra at that time, the Birrarung. But as settlement continued and the population grew after the gold rush and settlement was very dense near the river, these floods, which had hitherto nourished the Yarra Delta, became major flood risks to populations and to property. And this was a really major problem. In 1863, there was a flood of unparalleled severity, which caused loss of life in Richmond, South Yarra, and so on. And so there began to be a lot of pressure to try and do something to reduce the flooding risk. And not only that, but the ships were getting bigger, sail was giving way to steam, and it was very, very difficult for ships to negotiate, especially this bend in the river. And so the newly formed Melbourne Harbour Trust engaged British engineer Sir John Cood to give them some advice on how to address these twin problems of flooding and navigation for shipping. And Cood made many recommendations, but the one that I will focus on now was that he said that what should be done was to actually just cut off that bend in the river by creating this canal. And this is what was done, both with steam machinery and men with shovels. They dug a canal through here, and this remnant bit here is what we know as Cood Island today. And so in this photograph following, you can still see the former course of the Yarra River. But over time, it was filled in, it kind of withered and died. And I think for me, this is just a very seminal Yarra River story for us to think about the extent to which our river has been so drastically engineered to change its very, very nature. And in the course of all that excavation, sand, you know, this was sand that had been delivered from up in the catchment over thousands of years. And so it was like the richest sand mine ever. And so that sand was used for constructing things in Melbourne. And, you know, it was the finest quality sand you could find anywhere. It was fine like baker's flour. And it was also used in glass making. So this was part of the legacy of the Yarra River. So we're going to move away from Pier 35 now and start walking down the river towards the Westgate Bridge. And these are remnants of what used to be a place called Rotten Row. And because there was a lot of timber involved in ships in the early days, when they became old and decayed and died, you know, they had to do something with the ships, and they used to scuttle them here at Rotten Row, and they were huge fire risk to shipping higher up the river. And so there were quite a number of timber wharves here, quite decayed, where old and decaying ships used to come to rest. But they were also places where people made their home. So this is an example of a family called the Hickeys, who lived on a ship here at Rotten Row, and their children attended school in Port Melbourne, and it says here they were never late for school, but very unusual circumstances, living there, watching the shipping coming and going at that part of the river. So we're now going to just walk in to Westgate Park. And this photograph was taken several years ago now. This strip of land used to belong to the Port of Melbourne, and it was, you know, pretty neglected, as you can see. But over recent years, the Friends of Westgate Park have rehabilitated this section, this corridor alongside the river, and this land has now been included in Westgate Park. And I'm sorry I haven't got a more recent photograph of it, but I found that I didn't. So with the port is one of the shaping influences on this area, but of course, an uppermost in our mind in this very week is the Westgate Bridge itself, and how that has just had everything to do with this area. So in the 1960s, there grew a great pressure and lobby to create a river crossing from the west, because at that time, and I see Helen Barry's reminded us that her father used to deliver milk down here at the river, and at that time, the only way to get across the river at this point was on the Williamstown ferry, which many, or the ferry, which many people have memories of, you know, clanking chains that would drag the ferry over to Newport. But the thing was, it could only take 32 cars at a time. So when you think of the volume of traffic that goes over the Westgate Bridge now, and you know, this bridge was all about connecting the West, its industries, with the markets in the East and so on, and creating, you know, to be fair, you know, like one integrated metropolis before it was very divided. So I include this picture here of Sir Rupert Hamer and Sir Oscar Meyer, who was really the, you know, #1 advocate for this Lower Yarra Crossing Authority. And here they are at the opening of the bridge, or close to it. And I include it because apparently Sir Oscar Meyer stood up there on top of that bridge, and he looked down on the wasteland below that had been used for quarrying, sand mining, and as a staging area for the Westgate Bridge itself. And he said, this is going to be the area for a park, because thousands and thousands of people every day are going to look down, and, you know, it would be much better if it was a park. So in 1985, for the sesquicentenary of Victoria, the state government gifted the land to the people of Victoria in the form of Westgate Park. But it was very clearly understood that this was a park that was networked with the parks on the other side of the river. And when Joan Kerner became Premier, as you know, she was the member for Williamstown, it was equally important for her that those other parks on the western side of the river were part of it. So just going back to how the land was in the, you know, at the beginning, it was flat, flat, flat and flat, lower than flat in places. And so that was a challenge to the park builders, and they thought that it was too flat to be of interest. And so they went about creating a landscape with quite a number of hills. So if you've been in Westgate Park, you'll see there are quite a number of hills. But each of those hills and mounds was constructed. You know, they're not natural in any shape or form. They're made of constructed building material and then covered over with mulch and so on to become the place that is Westgate Park today. So I'm just including one photograph taken recently at Westgate Park. This is a dysphema. You may know this plant, the rounded noonflower. And in October, when it flowers, you might see caper white butterflies that have been blown here on the wind from New South Wales. But for the former Friends of Westgate Park, now Westgate Bili, biodiversity is absolutely their mission, and I encourage you to visit their website to get more of a sense of this. In Westgate Park, there are now 320 plants native to the Sandbelt region, 60 species of fungi and 52 species of birds. So as our president, Lynn Allison, says, there's genius in the life cycles of insects, their symbiotic relationships, the role of predators, herbivores, detritivores, pollinators, the primary producers of sugars, nectar and pollen. We identify birds by their calls and frogs by their celebration of rain, marvel at the colour of the camouflage of butterflies, dragonflies, flies, bees and beetles. We watch for the robustness that withstands droughts and caterpillars and all the balance that is necessary for biodiversity to be sustained. So it's really become a biodiverse oasis. And, you know, as I said before, we've got this sort of view that somehow the Yarra River in this part of the world is not worthy of our attention. But in here, we've got the chief scientist of Parks Victoria, Mark Norman, in the water, in his wetsuit. He's just emerged from the river after sampling some of the sediments and just seeing what he could find under there. And one of the most remarkable creatures to be found in the sediments are polychaetes. I don't know if you've heard of polychaetes, but there are over 13,000 species of polychaetes that have been described and many thousands more not yet described. And these are segmented bristle worms that eat all the decomposed material at the base of the river and a crucial part of the food chain. So, you know, it's not just the large creatures, the birds that we can see, but these invisible creatures hard at work that contribute to our biodiversity. Now, in the Q&A, you might like to enter what you think those green towers are, but this picture is very revealing, taken a number of years ago, because through Westgate Park not only runs the Westgate Bridge, that vital connector between east and west, but below the ground there are more services still on which Melbourne utterly depends. So this is the green, these are odour reduction facilities above the Melbourne main sewer, which runs under here. And then you'll see here the transmission tower that goes to the Newport Power Station. And what's not visible in this picture is the gas supply that also goes under here. So this is, you know, in terms of infrastructure, you could not get more significant and important infrastructure running through Westgate Park. And a few years ago, all those services were running through this very neglected, weedy ditch. And the Friends of Westgate Park thought that there was an opportunity here for open space. And so with the permission of all the relevant authorities, a chain of wetlands was created, avoiding all those services, of course, but creating a pedestrian and cycling path and adding hectares and hectares to Westgate Park. And the port boundary is just here on the side. So there's a lot going on in Westgate Park. And so now we're going to just watch a container ship go under Westgate Bridge. And this ship, the Yang Ming Vancouver, can carry 4,000 TEUs, that's 20-foot equivalent units. And there's always this sort of gaspy moment when you wonder, you know, will the ship ever fit under the bridge? But it does, because they're very careful about it. But I'd just like to say that this ship, which looks so large and is taking such a long time to make its way under the bridge, is half the size of the biggest container ship that recently called at the Port of Melbourne, the CGA Ural, which has a capacity of 10,000 TEUs. That's the measures of containers, 20-foot equivalent units. So ships are getting larger, and in order for those ships to be accommodated, you know, soon quite a number of them will be too large to fit under the Westgate Bridge and will need to call at Webb Dock instead. But it also requires all the skill and hydrodynamic modelling of the Port of Melbourne to ensure that these large ships are able to visit safely, because they virtually take up all the water in the river, you know, they displace it so. And this is a bit of a distraction, but I just couldn't believe this, this image, which is taken from a website called Vessel Finder, where you can find any ship traveling anywhere in the world, exactly where it is. And all these yellow triangles denote container ships. And it just gives you an idea of the density of container shipping in the world today. Okay, so now we're going to pause to do a bit of Q&A. So I'm going to just stop sharing for the moment, and let's have some Q&A before we take another step.
Sounds good. I think, Janet, we had one question beforehand about the presentation. Would there be, where can they see a copy of the chart that you had at the start?
Yes, Cox's chart of 1864 is freely downloadable from the State Library of Victoria website. So if you just go to that and look for Cox's chart, you'll find it and you can download a high resolution copy.
And then just confirming the photo before, it was sewage equipment of the green cylinders.
Okay, those green things. So as you can imagine, the sewer is full of noxious gases, and those gases were threatening to blow a hole in the Melbourne main sewer, which would have been drastic for all of us who rely on it. And so the port, I mean, you know, Melbourne Water, as their understanding and new technologies develop, this is a more biological odour reduction plant, those 3 green pillars. And so rather than the stink pipes that you used to have in the olden days, this is more, you know, disperses the odour through biological treatment.
And then Mark asks, were toxins found in the sediment?
I think, look, it's just absolutely unquestioned that, you know, that part of the river, and we're going to go to another part shortly, just from the uses that have been there over the last, you know, since white settlement, there's just no doubt that there are contaminants of every kind there. But I think it doesn't, you know, it doesn't mean that the river is dead. These things sort of coexist, I think. But I'm not, don't know too much about those things.
We also have one, just looking at the chat quickly, one from Sue. She's asking, was there a place in the Yarra called the Pool near Market Street?
There absolutely was. And when the port was much further up the river than it is today, the pool was the turning basin. You may know Bruce Armstrong's sculptures there just below Market Street that was the turning basin where the ships used to turn around. But now they turn around more near Pier 35 where we started off. But you can imagine as these new ships, 300 metres long or something, they need quite a bit of turning.
And I think Carol's question feeds in nicely to that comment. She's wondering, do you think Melbourne ports will extend Webb Dock to accommodate more of the big container ships?
Yes, well, I'd love to do another presentation one day on how Webb Dock has grown since the 1950s. And the port recently did a big expansion down at Webb Dock in about 2017. And that's clearly where they see the future of the port, at least for the short to medium term. And so I think there'll be further intensification of Webb Dock in the first instance, but I think it's always possible that they'll further extend it. And with Sue's question, do you think there'll ever be a large port at Hastings? No, I think it's looking less and less likely. I know that was canvassed at one time, but Infrastructure Victoria is now, you know, I think they're very much looking at the intensification of Webb Dock in the short to medium term, and then possibly Bay West in the longer term. I think Hastings is just deeply problematic, as all these proposals will be, but I think it's unlikely. Okay, so are we ready to saddle up again, head off, do you think?
I'd say so. And any questions that wouldn't be answered either now or at the end of the presentation, we'll be sending a follow-up email next week.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'll just return to the presentation. I just want to confirm, Kristen, that we're on.
Is it okay? Great.
Yeah, okay. All right, everyone. So we're now going to hop aboard the punt. Oh, So if you haven't ever taken the punt, you know, this is one of Melbourne's peak experiences, if you ask me. You don't need to ride a bike to take the punt. You can be a pedestrian and go on it. And it's, you know, for those of us who don't have a boat, but, you know, love to be on the water, it's a short journey to the other side, and it's just a huge amount of fun. But now, as we head over the river, this can't help but put itself on your attention. This huge fortification works that are going on around the base of one of the pillars of the Westgate Bridge. And as I look at it as we passed, I just thought, you know, every gap between every boulder there is an opportunity for ecological enlivening. You know, salt marsh could grow in there, birds could come there. And it would just be fantastic in, you know, what this is really obviously seen as, you know, such an important protective measure in case a ship went into this pillar. But wouldn't it be wonderful if at the same time these could be seen as an opportunity for ecological or not so much restoration, but just adding a bit of nature to this basalt pile. So walking on from where we get off the punt, this is the Westgate Bridge Memorial. And some of you may have come on another walk we did in Docklands and seen Mark Stoner's work, The River Runs Through It. This is another work by Mark Stoner. And each of these pillars remembers one of the 35 men who were killed in the collapse of the Westgate Bridge, or that section of it. They're evenly spaced, all are equal, and this is just on the edge of the alignment of where that section of the bridge fell. And now we're going to visit where the memorial is usually held each year. And I'm going to ask if we could just take a minute to reflect on those lives that were lost in this industrial accident on the 15th of October, 1970. Thank you. So we're now moving on to Stoney Creek. This is part of Stoney Creek that was realigned during the construction of the Westgate Bridge. So realigned, you know, actually moved, put into a concrete channel. This was Stoney Creek. As Tony Smith, who's got a long association with the Stoney Creek, says, the concrete and steel disease separating natural flows from the natural landscape. And this is not the only injury to have been done to the Stoney Creek. You'd all remember on the 30th of August 2018, the dreadful fire that led to this contamination of the Stony Creek, and this shows a boom holding back the contaminated water. So the EPA removed thousands and thousands, 2,500 cubic meters of contaminated sediment from the Stony Creek. And since then, an ambitious rehabilitation program has been developed in consultation with local people, but it's yet to be seen whether the creek will really recover. It's such a shocking accident. Not an accident, such a deliberate act of neglect and wanton vandalism. This shows the course of the Stony Creek from the fire site. And here's the concreted section down to the Stony Creek backwash. So this is a photograph taken shortly after the construction of the Westgate Bridge, and I think it shows the extent of the dereliction of both sides of the river. Westgate Park, where we were before, the southern wetlands newly created over here, but then here's the Stony Creek backwash. Now that was variously basalt quarry, meat preserving, glue factory, petroleum storage. You know, it has truly been a most abused river. And in 1986, so probably at about the same time as the creation of Westgate Park, Mark Adams planted 15,000 mangroves, white mangroves, into Stony Creek backwash. Now, you know, any of you been sort of in a mangrove environment, you'd know just how sticky and squelchy and feet sinking that this sort of environment is. But bold, valiant Mark Adams planted those mangroves, and after they were planted, they were beset by spills of one kind or another. But look at them today. Just look at that forest of mangroves. It's just absolutely the most wonderful and spectacular sight. They're densely planted. And in the foreground, there's salt marsh. And, you know, when you get to love salt marsh, there's really no other colours that will do the sort of spectrum of reds that they offer. And maybe I'll just go back a little bit. You know, when we started, we talked about the sort of wetland landscape that was characteristic of this area before white settlement. But really since then, you know, wetlands were on the nose because you couldn't build there. They were an impediment to everything. But now wetlands are, you know, being rediscovered for the values that they bring. And there's an amazing initiative called the Blue Carbon Lab at Deakin University. It's actually doing sampling in Stoney Creek and doing projects in other wetlands around the place. And they're discovering that blue carbon, what they call blue carbon, mangroves and its associated salt marshes, are much more effective, many, many more times more effective than terrestrial trees, you know, forests, in sequestering carbon. So mangroves are described as the ultimate giving tree. They're nurseries for fish, they stabilise shorelines, they sequester carbon, they're just all round amazing, amazing habitats. And so there's a lot of interest now, especially with climate change and sea level rise, in investing in wetlands like these to protect shorelines. And one of my favourite plants of all salt marsh is the beaded glasswort. It's got this, curious structure. But it is also very much the favoured food of the orange-bellied parrot, which is one of Australia's most endangered birds. It flies between Tasmania and the south coast of Victoria and South Australia. And, it's hanging by a thread, absolutely hanging by a thread. And were it not for a captive breeding program, it would certainly be extinct by now. So these habitats are vital for birds as well, absolutely vital. And so, investing in their care should be so important. And the orange-bellied parrot, I don't say it sort of idly, because this bird was present in Fisherman's Bend as recently as the 1950s. So, this is how rapidly extinction can happen. Now we're going to sort of making our way back to the punt now, but there's a very important place to visit, and this is Spotswood Pumping Station. Just an absolutely beautiful building in second French Empire classic revival style. And so this is part of the hugely ambitious infrastructure program in the 1890s to sewer Melbourne. Probably never been as big an infrastructure project as this. And it was, the first property in all of Melbourne to be sewered was actually in Port Melbourne. But in the process, of course, they had to tunnel under the Yarra, and conditions were very, very difficult for those tunnellers. There was the danger of water getting into their tunnel, noxious fumes, tunnel collapse. An absolutely astounding feat to create that tunnel under the Yarra to come out here at Spotswood, where the sewage was all pumped up to Brooklyn and thence fed by gravity to Werribee. And you'd all know that now Werribee is one of is a Ramsar listed wetland, famous for its bird life. The pumping station and the sewage scheme were put in the 1890s during Melbourne's very, very severe depression. And at the opening of the pumping station, the head of the Board of Works said, it doesn't matter how much this project costs. What matters is the lives that are saved. And it was true that, once the sewer went in, the death rate fell dramatically, especially from typhoid. So here's another view of this very fabulous building. And, when you get off the punt on the side of the river, you're almost at these entrance gates. And it's a deep regret that you actually have to walk around the building to enter ScienceWorks at the other side. So I really hope that, in future thinking about ScienceWorks, they'll consider opening up this as a very wonderful entrance into the ScienceWorks Museum. But the tragedy at the Westgate Bridge, which we have all marked this week, wasn't not the only tragedy there's been in this area, because when they were building the sewer on Good Friday in 1895, I don't fully understand the way the diaphragms and everything worked in the tunnel, but water got into the tunnel and the engineer and 5 of the workmen died. So there's just been many, industrial accidents and tragedies associated with this side of the river. So now we're just going to head back reluctantly, because there's so much more to explore, but we're going to go back to the punt to catch it back to the other side where you may have left your car. And before I finish and we go to some more questions, I'd just like to introduce you to two people. And these are, on the left, the Yarra River Keeper, Andrew Kelly, and on the right, Neil Blake, the Port Phillip Bay Keeper. And it's very fitting that they should be together in the estuary of the Yarra River, because, you know, this is where the river and the bay meet, where the waters mingle. And there's something about the expression that tells you that it's a very wonderful thing to be on a boat, even if you're trawling for microplastics. It's just a joy to be on the river. And I think that they would both join me in inviting you to consider how you too can become a Yarra River Keeper or a Port Phillip Bay Keeper, so that every input that goes into our waterways leads to the health rather than the detriment of our rivers. And so now I'm going to stop and look forward to your questions.
There's one question from Margaret. She's just wondering what the name of the organisation you suggested to visit about the flora and fauna of the Yarra River.
Oh, that's the name of the website is Westgate Biodiversity, Bili Nursery and Landcare.
There's a lovely comment in the chat, and it says lots of pobblebonk frogs have returned to life in Stony Creek this year compared to the last 2 years.
Fabulous news. Fabulous news. I just can't wait for Stoney Creek to, you know, after over a century of mistreatment, you know, to be able to return to being the river, you know, it was, because I just was, in preparing for this walk, it occurred to me that if a river could experience, you know, and many people might say it could experience trauma, it would be this, the Stoney Creek. You know, just had the most terrible things happen to it. And people love Stoney Creek. At the time of the fire, you know, people were just, you know, absolutely mourning the loss, you know, hopefully just for a short time, of this river they love so much.
We also have a nice question from Felicity. She's wondering if you have any favourite books or pieces of writing about the Yarra. I'd
just like to say hello to Felicity, who's probably her favourite river right now is the Birrarung, which is in her 5Ks, and we love the rivers of the West too. The favourite books about the Yarra, you know, to prepare for this walk, I dipped into them all, and this Dr. Gary Preslin's book, The Place for a Village, this Kirsten Otto's book, The Yarra, but I think a lovely book written some time ago now was Mayor Ward's The Comfort of Water, where she does a pilgrimage from the mouth to the source of the Yarra. That's very beautiful book. So, and I believe that Dr. Judith Buckrich is actually writing a history of the Yarra even as we speak. But others may have other suggestions. Oh, I've just seen this one, which I'd like to take. What are the legal rights now around Yarra River protection? Well, you know, it was one of the greatest achievements for the Yarra River Keeper Association to have been a key advocate for the Yarra River Protection Act, which is, you know, very far-reaching and ambitious piece of legislation. But since the Act was passed, there's been sort of some feeling that, you know, work has not advanced quite as rapidly as one would have liked. And we're now waiting on the Yarra River Strategic Plan, which is really the implementation of the Act. And so that's been, you know, it's all been considered and drafted and so on, but still not in the public domain. And there's another troubling thing, and that's something I'd like to share, that there are two major exclusions from the Yarra River Protection Act. One is the river south of the Bili Bridge. So the whole area we were in today is excluded from the provisions of the Yarra River Protection Act. And equally, the transport, any major transport projects like Northeast Link, Westgate Tunnel, not included in the Act. So, you know, that's a bit of a concern.
We also have a question from Andrew Kelly, so the riverkeeper. So he's wondering, do you think the port land will be turned into housing and all the port moved to Webb Dock and Bay West?
Well, I don't know, in that future thinking. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but I'd say that would be sort of a 50-year time horizon. Yeah, not anytime soon, probably not in my lifetime, I don't think, but quite likely afterwards.
And this is quite an interesting question from Lindsay. So she's seen a seal swimming in Vic Harbour, and she's seen 4 to 5 dolphins in the Yarra about a month or so ago. Do you think this is happening because of the lack of boating that's happened due to COVID?
Yeah, I mean, that's very, very interesting, isn't it? You know, here in Port Melbourne, we've seen, you know, wonderful things in the bay that we haven't seen for many, many years. And I think it could well be, as you say, that a quieter river and bay environment has. And I was just speaking to a friend of mine who was a fisherman and his family were fishermen for 100 years. And, you know, at the moment, fishing's not allowed. But, you know, if we come out of lockdown, we're coming into snapper season. And he said, you know, if the fishing season's opened in November, just going to be slaughter on the snapper, you know, because yeah, they're all spawning at the moment, but people will just fall on them. So I think we've got to really keep an eye on that. But I think maybe it's time to finish now. We've gone past 3 and it's been such fun, and I've loved looking at all your comments. It's also interesting, and, you know, I hope to see you down the river soon. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.